Well, now it now falls to David Wardrop to have the final task of this session, which is to connect the dots. David is the chair of the Westminster United Nations Association, which is obviously a co-sponsor of this particular conference. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, today's presentations have covered such very different aspects of this extraordinary episode in the history of the United Nations. And shortly, participants at our round table will discuss how we can assist the UN Secretary General and Justice Ostman, leading the investigation, in identifying relevant sources of information, and how we can influence key member states to assist the investigation more wholeheartedly. I will touch on some of the points raised today, but let's recall what was happening in the geopolitical sphere at the time Hammarskjöld took his bold decision to fly to the Congo, seeking to prevent the crisis there unfolding even further. What else was on his plate? President Khrushchev had proposed a troika of officials to replace his own post as Secretary General. President Kennedy was due to address the General Assembly, tackling the admission of Red China, disarmament, nuclear testing, and the status of Berlin, as Khrushchev had just proposed that it should replace New York as the UN host city. And the British dug in along the Kuwait-Iraq border, protecting the new independent sheikhdom following threats by Iraqi Premier Qasem, who claimed Kuwait as an Iraqi province. A small force of Irish peacekeepers had been taken captive in Jadotville, Katanga. And in Gaza, yes, there was Gaza. And still, he flew to the Congo. Within, as discussed this morning, without really a green light from the Security Council. And then this. The front page of the local newspaper, the Northern News. With African and Asian states now a numerical majority at the UN, what different line should Kennedy take? And how interesting to listen to Dr. Phant Mintu talking about those following days and months when U Phant became Secretary General. But first, to our speakers, some of us came together about 10 years ago, triggered by the book Who Killed Hammarskjöld, written by Susan Williams, just spoken. Some were already researching Hammarskjöld's career, others not content with how the causes of the plane crash had been comfortably assumed, and some with startling new information. This all led to the setting up of the independent Hammarskjöld Commission chaired by Sir Stephen Sedley, which published its findings at the Peace Palace at The Hague in 2013. Using this, we lobbied the General Assembly President and the large diplomatic community in London, pressing them to support the reopening of the 62 UN inquiry. But it was the incoming government in Sweden that year which gave the boost, capably steering the resolution through the General Assembly, leading to the reopening of the inquiry. That was December 30th, with 75 nations as co-signatories. Since then, we have hunted down documents in several countries, traced those still living who could provide contemporary knowledge, analyzed images, reviewed theories, and we have not hesitated to criticize our own nations when we believe they have blatantly sought to frustrate this legitimate pursuit of the truth, undertaken in the name of the United Nations, in the name of we the peoples. And yes, we the peoples, not we the governments. UK Premier Clement Attlee addressed that point in 1945 when proposing in Parliament that the UK should join the United Nations. The Charter does not start by saying we the governments, he said. It starts by saying we the peoples. It expressed the fact that it is an endeavour to put into practical form the deep feelings of all the peoples, including the fighting men who have made it possible to have a charter at all. And this is reinforced by Secretary General Guterres, whose words we heard this morning and just been repeated by Stephen Matthias. So why did the plane crash? Besides looking through documents, signals, and agents to their governments back home and more, there were practical questions. If there was an attack, which aircraft might have been used? Originally in the frame were the de Havilland Dove, the Dornier 28, but Dr. O'Malley this morning firmly points to the sole Fouga Magister flying in the Katanga Air Force at the time, harassing the UN strafing Congolese people. Flown by whom? The Katangese had a dozen or so who were in the frame, and there were decades of many more unchallenged claims also. Were logbooks faked or even exist? Dr. O'Malley and Dr. Williams have been pretty explicit in pointing fingers, but is that really only the tip of an iceberg of claims and counterclaims? And from which airfield might the plane have come? Which were in reach, paved or not? And what were its intentions, if not to shoot down Hammarskjöld's plane? As we heard, with the two French speakers found near the cockpit, did that imply radio contact with Francophone speakers in an effort to divert the plane to another airstrip? Behind it all, some claim, was the wealth of the Belgian mining empire Union Minière and its supporters in Europe, some here in Britain. So who was pulling whose strings? And might we have access to the closed archives of Union Minière's successor, Unicorn, again? And then the search and rescue operation. Susan Williams sets out on the inconsistencies on both official reports and personal recollections. Were those strangely uniformed personnel seen at the crash site many hours before the official confirmation of its discovery, and who then disappeared? Who were they? Listening to the presentation from Maureen Picard just now, speaking from New York, might they have been the members of the French Colonel Folk's group of mercenaries? Why there? After all, the border with rebel Katanga was very close, and we know mercenaries were present at the airport at the time Hammarskjöld's plane was due to land, and relaxed about it. One wonders how possibly they could get on with the troops of the Rhodesian forces there, with their 30 aircraft, their crews and support. So let's summarize. Justice Othman had led in the publication of 4 reports to the Secretary General, the expert panel 2015, and his reports of 2017, 2019, and 22, and the next due this year. Support in the General Assembly to continue the inquiry has grown upon publication of each report from 75 in 2013 to 100, then 128 and 142. This last, another statistic I will return to. As the inquiry progressed, the judge continued to ask for assistance from key member states, asking them to check their security and intelligence records and archives. The degree of cooperation varied greatly. Some states showed both sincerity and energy. In his 2019 report, the Justice summarized the performance of 14 member states, as would a football writer after a match. Who were the star players? Canada, Belgium, Zambia, the DRC, Portugal, Germany. I could continue, but the 10 points surely goes to Zimbabwe. Professional, thorough, committed. And who should have been pulled from the pitch and given an early bath? In the early days, surely Sweden. Could it have taken a more proactive stance over those several decades? Its change of government in 2013 was so fortunate, the factor which led to the UN resolution to reopen the inquiry. Its recent efforts to assist the inquiry have been commendable. However, as Henning Melber articulated this morning, an MP linked to the ruling coalition has initiated moves to support with support from other coalition parties, to re-examine Sweden's stance at the time of the crash, maybe even suggesting the setting up of a truth commission. And we heard the comments of the foreign minister to the MP there. France. I can add nothing to Morin Picard's devastating overview of the complicated involvement of French nationals at the time and the legacy they have left. The fallout from the struggle for Algerian independence, creating new recruits to the cadres of soldiers of fortune sought by the Katandis and their rich backers, all adding more dots to try and link up. South Africa. It's remarkable that for a long time, the South African government was judged by many of us as frankly disengaged. At best, supported documents have been inexplicably mislaid. At worst, it seemed for a while that apartheid-era people still ran its secret service. But it is not my voice that should be heard here, rather one from Africa. This is the advice given to President Ramaphosa by Cameron Duodu, the highly respected commentator from Ghana. Comrade, it is not just a matter for the continent, but the whole of the UN. Please, you need to save the honor of South Africa. Please, you do not owe the apartheid regime any protection. If the ANC agreed to keep the apartheid era's murderous secrets under wraps, that agreement was invalid. It was reached by your negotiators under duress. Take the US. I won't repeat Susan Williams' details points, so I summarize. We encounter denial about the supply by the CIA to Katanga of Fouga Magistrate jets, denial about the presence of US Dakota planes in Andola, obstruction to efforts to confirm the military service of key witnesses, pages of documents generously provided, practically all redacted, as Susan has said. And as Susan finishes off, seemingly indifferent to the fate of 4 US citizens. Now the UK. The accident happened on UK colonial territory, Northern Rhodesia. In the field at the time were at least one agent of the MI6, and GCHQ was involved in intercepting radio traffic. Possibly. What records might they have? This sort of question customarily triggers the response of neither confirm nor deny, of course. But what do we make of Dr. Mandy Banton's contribution? It is not a mountain of archives, but she says a mountain range. Besides the question why former colonial documents are withheld, there remains another question. Whose records are they? Not as newsworthy as the repatriation of the Beni and Bronzes, but surely part of any new independent state's identity. I stated earlier that as the inquiry progressed, the judge turned to key member states, asking them to check their records and archives, this time appointing a high-ranking and independent person to lead this. How did the UK respond? Susan Williams touched on this, but let me share with you the grisly detail. Judge Othman wrote to the UK ambassador on the 20th of March 2019, asking for a report of the review by the 3rd of November. No reply from this P5 state. He wrote again on the 30th of April. No reply from this P5 state. Again on the 15th of June. No reply from this P5 state. 3 days after closing date of submission of responses, a UK minister replied, stating that the UK would not appoint the requested high-ranking and independent person. Some might call that downright rude. So I initiated a freedom of information request to the UK government, asking for all correspondence relating to this UN's particular request over those few months. I said to myself, there can't be much of it. I won't waste time with a request, how my request was treated. 15 months after the original request, an official who oversees the reviewing of Foreign Office documents prior to their transfer to the National Archives, by no means high-ranking and independent person, was charged with the task of trekking across that veritable mountain range of archives, unknown territory, Mandy Banton tells us that miraculously he completed this in 4 weeks. Here, my friends, round the world, we have a new Hercules. Cleaning the Augean stables would have been a mere foothills to this intrepid mountaineer. Attempts to find out whether his work extended to the records of MI5, MI6, GCHQ were evaded, so we don't know the answer. But it is reasonable hypothesis that they did not extend that far. To do so would have been breach of the UK government's standard policy that doesn't comment on security and intelligence matters. But does it? When might the GCHQ ever make a statement? There's a precedent. In 2019, Donald Trump repeated unproven and unverified accusations from 2017 that British intelligence agencies spied on his election campaign. GCHQ considered itself forced to make a statement. The allegations are nonsense, utterly ridiculous, and should be ignored. This shows the intelligence agency can respond publicly if it feels there's a good reason. Is the sudden death of the UN Secretary General not good enough reason? Anyway, it was for the justice to assess the UK's degree of cooperation. I quote from his report. The 2020 and 2021 responses of the independent appointee of the United Kingdom did not address my specific requests for information. So that's it. But is it? I've mentioned that the most recent decision by the General Assembly to pursue the investigation was supported by 141 states, but not by the UK and the US. A similar number of countries, 141, backed the resolution calling for peace in Ukraine and withdrawal of Russian troops. But in that Ukraine vote, 35 states, many in Africa, chose to abstain, a gesture widely interpreted as a statement by the Global South that the US and the UK might have become out of touch. As much as these two P5 states may complain at that, there's a link there which others can plainly see. So the message is, why continue to be on the wrong side of history, we ask? As Hammarskjöld stated at the General Assembly to great applause and table thumping that day led by Khrushchev himself, the UN is not for the big powers, but for the others. I ask the question again, why did that plane crash? What progress is being made? Now the Justice has indicated that the majority of new information is coming not from governments, but from independent researchers. And here's an example. The initial Rhodesian inquiry conducted in '61 stated that the settings of all propellers at the crash site was in the normal configuration. But were they? Recently, an independent expert has disputed this. This image shows one of the 4 engines. Why are the propellers in reverse thrust mode? Why might the pilot have engaged reverse thrust in flight? Impossible to activate by mistake. Maybe under attack, the earliest possible, slowest possible landing was considered the preferred option. We hope that a definitive analysis can be completed to clarify this soon. Now, I'm not going to go into this business, except that to draw your attention to the Hammarskjöld inquiry website we've been running for 10 years. This includes all the detail of the Hammarskjöld Commission set up and led by Sir Stephen Sedley. Every report of the judge, the panel report, and the 3 subsequent reports, links to important websites on the subject, including that of Dr. Roger Lipsey. And as you can see, just perhaps the most recent news entry of the 100 news entries there are there discusses in detail this hypothesis about the strangeness of the reverse thrust discovery of the propellers and missed by the original inquiry. Every hypothesis lasts as long as the day it's disproven. But this, I understand, is being taken up by the justice because it's disputed and it's got to be tackled. This is the website that I hope all those on the Zoom session will return to again and again to find out the progress of this important inquiry. So, for now, with the encouragement of more than 2/3 of all UN member states, we will continue to speak truth to power because, as I said at the start, we are the peoples. And I extend that to all of us watching this, the peoples of the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for a very helpful summary of all that we've been through today, and a lot more too.